On a cold night in May 1942, as most Australians slept, believing the war was something happening far away in Europe and North Africa, a faint silhouette slipped silently past the heads of Sydney Harbour. It was not a fishing trawler. It was not a cargo vessel. It was a Japanese midget submarine, carrying two young men on what they knew was likely a one-way mission. Beneath the calm waters of one of the world's most beautiful harbors, war had arrived at Australia's doorstep, and for decades, much of what truly happened that night would remain quietly buried. This is the hidden story of how Australia, often imagined as distant and untouched, became a covert battleground in the Second World War, of secret intelligence networks, unpublicized sabotage fears, indigenous trackers guarding the North, internment camps on remote soil, and a nation forced to grow up almost overnight. In early 1942, Australia stood exposed. The fall of Singapore in February shattered the long-held belief that the British Empire could shield the continent. When Japanese aircraft bombed Darwin on 19 February 1942, killing more than 240 people and sinking 8 ships, it was the largest attack ever mounted by a foreign power on Australian soil. Panic rippled through the country. Rumors of invasion spread. Civilians dug air raid shelters in suburban backyards from Perth to Brisbane. But what most Australians never knew was how deeply intelligence agencies were already fighting a shadow war. In Melbourne, in an unassuming building, a top-secret unit known as the Central Bureau had been formed in 1942. Staffed by Australian and American cryptographers, mathematicians, linguists, and radio specialists, it intercepted and decrypted Japanese military communications across the Pacific. Working in stifling rooms filled with clattering machines, they broke codes that revealed troop movements, supply routes, and strategic intentions. The intelligence they produced helped turn the tide in campaigns across New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. Yet for decades after the war, their contributions were classified, their names unknown even to family members. Meanwhile, along the vast northern coastline, thousands of kilometers of sparsely populated terrain, another hidden defense took shape. The Northern Territory Special Reconnaissance Unit, composed largely of indigenous Australians, was created to patrol remote areas and watch for signs of Japanese landings. These men, many from Arnhem Land communities, used deep knowledge of country to navigate swamps, escarpments, and mangroves silently. They received little recognition at the time. Some were not even formally enlisted, meaning their service went unrecorded in official military roles. Yet they formed a human early warning system across one of the most vulnerable frontiers on Earth. As fear of invasion intensified, the Australian government implemented emergency powers. Coastal towns rehearsed evacuation plans. Bridges were wired for demolition. In Western Australia, plans existed to destroy Fremantle Harbour if Japanese forces approached. Oil storage facilities were prepared for self-destruction to prevent enemy capture. In Sydney, after the midget submarine attack in late May 1942 damaged the harbour and sank the depot ship HMS Kutabo, killing 21 sailors, authorities launched a massive anti-submarine net project. Steel barriers were stretched across the harbour entrance. Patrol boats and searchlights scanned the darkness nightly. What the public did not see were the intelligence intercepts suggesting further operations might be planned. Even more quietly, Australia became a center for Allied special operations. In Melbourne, in an unassuming building, a top-secret unit known as the Central Bureau had been formed in 1942. Staffed by Australian and American cryptographers, mathematicians, linguists, and radio specialists, it intercepted and decrypted Japanese military communications across the Pacific. Working in stifling rooms filled with clattering machines, they broke codes that revealed troop movements, supply routes, and strategic intentions. The intelligence they produced helped turn the tide in campaigns across New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. Yet for decades after the war, their contributions were classified, their names unknown even to family members. Meanwhile, along the vast northern coastline, thousands of kilometers of sparsely populated terrain, another hidden defense took shape. The Northern Territory Special Reconnaissance Unit, composed largely of indigenous Australians, was created to patrol remote areas and watch for signs of Japanese landings. These men, many from Arnhem Land communities, used deep knowledge of country to navigate swamps, escarpments, and mangroves silently. They received little recognition at the time. Some were not even formally enlisted, meaning their service went unrecorded in official military roles. Yet they formed a human early warning system across one of the most vulnerable frontiers on Earth. As fear of invasion intensified, the Australian government implemented emergency powers. Coastal towns rehearsed evacuation plans. Bridges were wired for demolition. In Western Australia, plans existed to destroy Fremantle Harbour if Japanese forces approached. Oil storage facilities were prepared for self-destruction to prevent enemy capture. In Sydney, after the midget submarine attack in late May 1942 damaged the harbor and sank the depot ship HMS Kutabu, killing 21 sailors, authorities launched a massive anti-submarine net project. Steel barriers were stretched across the harbor entrance. Patrol boats and searchlights scanned the darkness nightly. What the public did not see were the intelligence intercepts suggesting further operations might be planned. Even more quietly, Australia became a center for Allied special operations. In Melbourne, in an unassuming building, a top-secret unit known as the Central Reconnaissance Department, codenamed Z Special Unit, trained volunteers for some of the most daring missions of the war. One of their most audacious operations was Operation Jaywick in 1943. Disguised as Asian fishermen aboard a captured Japanese vessel renamed the Crept, a small team sailed from Western Australia to Singapore Harbour. Under cover of darkness, they paddled folding kayaks to attach limpet mines to Japanese ships. When the explosives detonated, 7 enemy vessels were sunk or severely damaged. The raiders escaped undetected, sailing thousands of kilometers back to Australia. The mission was so improbable it seemed fictional, yet it was real. Planned in Australia, launched from Australian waters. The continent also hosted a complex network of internment camps. Italian, German, and Japanese nationals, some long-term residents, were detained as enemy aliens. In places like Hay in New South Wales and Tatura in Victoria, thousands lived behind barbed wire. Among them were Jewish refugees who had fled Nazi Germany, only to be interned by the very nation that offered them sanctuary. The situation reflected the fear and suspicion of the era. Some internees later contributed significantly to Australian science, arts, and commerce after release, quietly reshaping post-war society. Up north, the war's brutality reached its peak along the Kokoda Track in Papua New Guinea, then an Australian territory. Young Australian soldiers, many barely out of school, fought through mud, jungle, malaria, and relentless enemy assault. The campaign halted Japan's southward advance, yet supply lines ran through Brisbane and Townsville. Hospitals treated wounded in Australian cities. Factories in Melbourne and Adelaide produced uniforms, ammunition, and aircraft parts at unprecedented speed. Women entered industrial workforces in large numbers. The Australian Women's Army Service, Women's Auxiliary Air Force, and Women's Royal Australian Naval Service expanded rapidly. They drove trucks, operated radar, decoded messages, and maintained aircraft. After the war, many were expected to return quietly to domestic roles, but their experience had already altered social expectations forever. One of the most secretive chapters involved Australia's role in signals intelligence that fed into the broader Allied code-breaking effort, complementing work at Britain's Bletchley Park. Though not as famous, Australian stations intercepted vast amounts of Japanese naval traffic. This intelligence contributed to decisive engagements like the Battle of the Coral Sea, fought partly in waters off Queensland, where the Japanese advance no longer relies solely on Britain. Prime Minister John Curtin famously declared that Australia looked to America free of any pangs as to our traditional links or kinship with the United Kingdom. It marked a profound realignment in foreign policy. When the war ended in 1945, Australians celebrated victory, yet the hidden machinery of wartime transformation continued shaping the nation. The government launched an ambitious immigration program, driven by the slogan, "Populate or Perish." Millions arrived from war-torn Europe. Displaced persons camps in Europe became recruitment grounds. Ships docked in Fremantle and Melbourne, carrying families who would help build post-war Australia. Among them were engineers, doctors, artists, and laborers whose skills would transform infrastructure and culture. One monumental project born from this era was the Snowy Mountains Scheme. Constructed between 1949 and 1974, it diverted water from the Snowy River to irrigate inland farms and generate hydroelectric power. Over 100,000 workers from more than 30 countries participated. Tunnels were blasted through mountains. Towns emerged in remote alpine regions. It became a symbol of modern Australia's engineering ambition and of its emerging multicultural identity. Yet, even as the country modernized, unresolved histories persisted. For Indigenous Australians, wartime service did not immediately translate to equal rights. Many returned from military duty to find they were still denied citizenship status and basic freedoms in their own land. The 1967 referendum, in which over 90% of voters supported constitutional change to include Aboriginal people in the census and allow federal laws on their behalf, marked a watershed. It did not grant instant equality, but it signaled overwhelming public support for reform. In the decades that followed, the hidden stories of frontier conflict, dispossession, and resistance slowly entered public consciousness. The Mabo decision of 1992 overturned the doctrine of terra nullius, legally recognizing native title for the first time. It acknowledged what Indigenous Australians had always known: the land had never been empty. Meanwhile, Cold War tensions brought new secrecy. Australia hosted joint defense facilities with the United States, including Pine Gap near Alice Springs, an intelligence installation central to global surveillance networks. Its precise functions remained shrouded in classification, fueling debate about sovereignty and security. Through bushfires, droughts, economic booms, and recessions, Australia continued evolving. The Sydney 2000 Olympic Games showcased a confident, diverse nation to the world. Cathy Freeman lighting the cauldron symbolized both sporting excellence and the aspiration for reconciliation. Today, when Australians walk along the cliffs overlooking Sydney Harbour, it is difficult to imagine enemy submarines beneath the waves. When travelers drive across the Northern Territory, they rarely think of Indigenous patrols guarding against invasion. When skiers glide across the snowy mountains, they may not picture the migrant laborers who carved tunnels deep within rock. Yet these hidden threads form an essential part of the national fabric. Australia's story is not merely one of distant isolation and sunlit beaches. It is a story of secret code breakers in dimly lit rooms, of covert raiders paddling silently into enemy harbors, of communities confronting fear of invasion, of migrants rebuilding both themselves and their adopted homeland, of First Nations warriors defending country long before global wars reached its shores. It is astonishing because so much of it remained untold for so long. And perhaps that is the most compelling truth of all. Beneath the familiar landmarks and celebrated milestones lies a deeper narrative, complex, courageous, sometimes uncomfortable, that continues to surface, reshaping how Australians understand their past and imagine their future. The harbor is calm now.
The morning after the midget submarines slipped into Sydney Harbour, newspapers spoke in careful tones. Headlines reported explosions, casualties, and tightened defenses. But behind closed doors, Australia's military and political leaders were confronting something far more unsettling than a single daring raid: the realization that the continent was now an active battlefield in a global intelligence war. Within weeks of the Darwin bombings and the Sydney Harbour attack, Australia accelerated the expansion of secret installations scattered across its vast landscape. Remote airstrips appeared in dusty outback towns. Radar stations were erected along coastlines. Camouflaged communication posts operated under strict silence protocols. Entire facilities existed on maps under false names. In Brisbane, General Douglas MacArthur had established his Southwest Pacific Area headquarters. From there, Allied strategy for the Pacific Theater was coordinated. Yet while public attention focused on troop movements and naval clashes, cryptographic breakthroughs quietly shaped decisions. Intercepted Japanese naval codes revealed convoy routes and supply vulnerabilities. Australian operators working around the clock fed intelligence into planning rooms where campaigns were mapped in pencil on oversized charts. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942 was one of the first turning points influenced by signals intelligence. Though tactically inconclusive, it halted Japan's push toward Port Moresby. It was also the first major naval engagement fought entirely by aircraft carriers, ships never sighting each other directly. For Australians, the battle meant the difference between an advancing enemy and a stalled one just beyond the horizon. But the hidden war was not limited to oceans and jungles. Across the Australian mainland, authorities feared espionage and sabotage. Industrial centers in Newcastle, Whyalla, and Port Kembla operated under blackout conditions. Steel production surged to support Allied demands. Workers toiled long hours beneath dimmed lights, aware that Japanese reconnaissance aircraft had already photographed some facilities. Rumors of enemy agents circulated widely. In truth, while a few espionage efforts were attempted, many fears were exaggerated. Still, the atmosphere of suspicion had real consequences. Thousands of residents of Italian and German descent, some born in Australia, were classified as enemy aliens. Fishing boats were confiscated, radios were restricted, movement was monitored. In Western Australia, Fremantle became the largest submarine base in the Southern Hemisphere. American, British, and Dutch submarines operated from its harbor, launching patrols deep into Japanese-controlled waters. Fremantle's quiet streets concealed a nerve center of undersea warfare. Sailors would disappear for months at a time, their missions classified. Many never returned. Meanwhile, far to the north, the Arnhem Land patrols continued their silent watch. Indigenous reconnaissance members navigated terrain impenetrable to conventional units. Their tracking skills were unmatched. They observed unusual footprints, distant smoke plumes, changes in coastal patterns. Their contribution remained largely unrecognized for decades, overshadowed by conventional military narratives. On the home front, rationing reshaped daily life. Butter, tea, sugar, petrol, each item carefully measured. Children collected scrap metal for recycling drives. Victory gardens sprouted in suburban yards. The war entered kitchens, classrooms, and community halls. Women stepped into roles previously close to them. They worked in munitions factories assembling artillery shells. They staffed air raid warning systems. They maintained aircraft engines and plotted flight paths. Some served in coastal observation posts, scanning the sea for silhouettes against the sunrise. In 1943, Operation JWIC proved that Australia could strike back with audacity. The small team that sailed the Crept into Singapore Harbour did so relying on deception, courage, and meticulous planning. Their success demonstrated the reach of Allied special operations. But a later mission, Operation Remau in 1944, ended in tragedy when most participants were captured and executed. The risks of covert warfare were unforgiving. As Allied forces pushed northward through New Guinea, the Kokoda campaign became a defining crucible. Young Australians endured relentless rain, steep ridges, disease, and constant engagement. The campaign halted Japan's overland advance toward Port Moresby. It also forged a narrative of endurance deeply embedded in Australian identity.
Yet even as victory seemed possible by 1944, Australia remained alert. Japanese submarines continued occasional operations in surrounding waters. Coastal convoys sailed under escort. Defensive structures dotted beaches from Queensland to Western Australia. When atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, the war ended abruptly. Celebrations erupted across Australian cities. Crowds filled streets in Sydney, Melbourne, Adelaide, and Perth. But amid the relief, another transformation was underway. Australia emerged from the war changed, strategically, socially, and psychologically. It had hosted Allied command centers, coordinated intelligence operations, and defended its own shores. The illusion of distance as protection was gone forever. In the war's aftermath, secrecy lingered. Many operations remained classified. Veterans of covert units often could not speak of their missions, even to family members. Indigenous patrol members returned quietly to communities that received little official acknowledgement of their service. But the war had accelerated Australia's shift toward a new global posture. The alliance with the United States deepened. Defense planning became more regionally focused. Immigration policy expanded dramatically, reshaping demographics and culture. The hidden war had forged a more independent nation. And yet, as the world entered the Cold War era, new shadows emerged. Intelligence cooperation intensified. Remote facilities were constructed in Australia's interior, designed for surveillance and strategic monitoring. The outback, once considered empty and isolated, became geopolitically significant. The midget submarines resting on the harbor floor were eventually raised. Memorials were built. Historical research uncovered layers of forgotten contributions. Gradually, the hidden dimensions of wartime Australia came to clear view. But many Australians walking along beaches, driving across desert highways, or standing on harbor cliffs remain unaware of how close history once came to turning differently, how invasion fears shaped policy, how cryptographers in quiet rooms altered battles hundreds of Aussic away, how indigenous knowledge protected northern shores, how covert raiders struck enemy strongholds from Australian waters. The war that seemed distant had for a time been deeply local. And beneath the calm surface of modern Australia, the echoes of that hidden struggle still linger, reminding.
When the war ended in 1945, Australia did not simply return to normal. There was no true normal left to return to. The nation that it once believed itself shielded by distance now understood that geography alone could not guarantee safety. Beneath the celebrations of victory, a quieter question took hold in Canberra and across military headquarters. What kind of country would Australia become in a world divided by new superpowers? The answer began forming almost immediately. Prime Minister Ben Chifley pushed forward an ambitious reconstruction program. The aim was not only economic recovery, but national transformation. Wartime industries were redirected toward civilian production. Infrastructure projects were prioritized. Education expanded under the Commonwealth Reconstruction Training Scheme, giving returning servicemen opportunities to attend university or learn trades. But perhaps the most consequential shift was demographic. Australia's population in 1945 was just over 7 million, small for a continent of such scale. The government feared vulnerability through underpopulation. The phrase, "populate or perish," became a national doctrine. Under Immigration Minister Arthur Calwell, Australia launched one of the most ambitious migration programs in modern history. Ships arrived from war-ravaged Europe carrying displaced persons, Poles, Ukrainians, Balts, Yugoslavs, many of whom had lost everything. They were sent initially to migrant reception centers in places like Bonegilla in Victoria. From there, they were assigned to large-scale projects, railways, factories, dams. One of the most extraordinary undertakings was the Snowy Mountains Hydroelectric Scheme. Conceived as both an engineering marvel and a nation-building exercise, it aimed to divert water from the Snowy River westward for irrigation while generating hydroelectric power. More than 100,000 workers from over 30 nations contributed between 1949 and 1974. Tunnels were carved through granite mountains. Entire towns emerged in alpine valleys. It was a bold statement that Australia was no longer a fragile outpost. It was capable of monumental ambition. Yet while Europe helped build modern Australia, another more uncomfortable story was unfolding. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, the Cold War intensified. Australia signed the ANZUS Treaty in 1951, formalizing its security alliance with the United States and New Zealand. Defense cooperation deepened. In the remote desert near Alice Springs, a joint facility known as Pine Gap was established in 1966. Officially described as a research site, it became a key node in global satellite intelligence systems. Its operations were secretive, sparking public debate about sovereignty and foreign policy, debates that continue today. Meanwhile, nuclear testing reshaped parts of the Australian landscape. Between 1952 and 1963, the British government conducted atomic weapons tests at locations including the Montebello Islands and Maralinga in South Australia. Many Australians were unaware of the full scale and potential consequences of these tests at the time. Indigenous communities were displaced. Some were exposed to radiation without proper warning or protection. Decades later, investigations revealed long-term health and environmental impacts, prompting compensation efforts and formal apologies. While global politics reshaped defense strategy, domestic social change gathered momentum. Indigenous Australians who had served in both world wars returned to a country that still denied them basic rights. In many states, they faced restrictions on movement, employment, and voting. Activism grew steadily. Leaders such as Charles Perkins organized the 1965 Freedom Ride through rural New South Wales, exposing segregation and discrimination. Television coverage brought stark realities into suburban living rooms. In 1967, Australians voted overwhelmingly in a referendum to amend the Constitution, allowing the federal government to legislate for Aboriginal people and include them in the census. More than 90% voted yes. It was one of the most decisive referendums in Australian history, a signal that public sentiment was shifting. But the struggle for recognition did not end there. In 1972, activists established the Aboriginal Tent Embassy on the lawns opposite Parliament House in Canberra. It began as a beach umbrella symbolizing political exile in their own land. It became a lasting symbol of protest and land rights advocacy. Then, in 1992, a landmark High Court decision changed the legal foundation of the nation. The Mabo case overturned the doctrine of terra nullius, the notion that Australia had belonged to no one prior to British arrival. Native title was recognized for the first time in Australian law. It was a profound acknowledgement that the continent's history stretched back tens of thousands of years before 1788. While political reform unfolded, Australia's economics underwent transformation. The long post-war boom eventually gave way to stagflation in the 1970s. Economic reforms accelerated under Prime Minister Bob Hawke and Treasurer Paul Keating in the 1980s. The Australian dollar was floated in 1983. Tariffs were reduced. Financial markets were deregulated. These moves integrated Australia more deeply into the global economy, particularly within the Asia-Pacific region. Culturally, the nation's identity broadened. The dismantling of the White Australia policy between the late 1960s and early 1970s opened doors to migration from Asia and beyond. Vietnamese refugees arrived after the Vietnam War. Later waves included migrants from Lebanon, China, India, and Africa. Suburbs transformed, cuisine diversified, languages multiplied. Sport and culture became shared arenas of pride. When Kathy Freeman lit the Olympic cauldron at the Sydney 2000 Games, it was more than spectacle. It symbolized aspiration toward reconciliation and unity under the Southern Cross. Yet Australia continued to face natural tests. Drought cycles intensified. Bushfires periodically ravaged vast regions. The Black Saturday fires of 2009 and the Black Summer fires of 2019 to 2020 burned millions of hectares, destroying homes and wildlife on an unprecedented scale. These disasters revealed both vulnerability and extraordinary community resilience. Through it all, the memory of 1942 lingered quietly in strategic thinking. Defense white papers consistently emphasized the need for regional awareness. Northern bases were upgraded, alliances strengthened. The Indo-Pacific became central to policy discussions. Today, when Australians debate national identity, republic or monarchy, climate policy, reconciliation, immigration. They do so in the shadow of layered history. The hidden war of the 1940s, the nuclear tests of the desert, the migrant-built dams, the activist campaigns for indigenous rights, the Cold War intelligence outposts, all are threads in a complex tapestry. Australia is often portrayed as relaxed, sunlit, and easygoing, and in many ways it is. But beneath that image lies a nation shaped by moments of quiet urgency, times when decisions made in dim rooms or remote deserts altered its trajectory. From the code breakers who intercepted enemy messages, to the migrants who carved tunnels through mountains, to the activists who challenged constitutional silence, each generation added depth to the story. The harbor remains peaceful, the outback sky stretches wide and empty, yet history here has never been simple. It has been layered, contested, and astonishing. And the story, still unfolding, continues to ask the same question first whispered in 1942. What does it truly mean to defend a continent at the edge of the world?
By the late 20th century, Australia no longer feared invasion fleets on the horizon. The anxiety of 1942 had faded into memory, but new tensions were emerging, less visible than warships, more complex than bombers overhead. The battlefield was no longer defined by coastlines. It was defined by influence, economics, information, and identity. The Cold War had ended, but uncertainty had not. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, Australia's strategic focus shifted decisively toward the Asia-Pacific region. Trade with Japan had already transformed the economy during the post-war boom. Now, rapidly rising economies like South Korea, Singapore, and later China were reshaping global markets. Iron ore from Western Australia, coal from Queensland, and agricultural exports flowed outward in volumes unimaginable just decades earlier. But economic opportunity carried strategic weight. Australia deepened its alliance with the United States, participating in joint military exercises and intelligence cooperation. Pine Gap, once shrouded almost entirely in secrecy, became publicly acknowledged as a satellite surveillance and signals intelligence facility. Though still highly classified in its operations, its presence symbolized Australia's integration into global security networks. At the same time, the Australian Defence Force underwent transformation. Rather than preparing solely for large-scale conventional invasion, planners emphasized regional stability operations. This shift would soon be tested. In 1999, violence erupted in East Timor after its population voted for independence from Indonesia. Militias backed by elements of the Indonesian military launched widespread destruction. Australia led the international force for East Timor, deploying thousands of troops to restore order. The mission was risky and diplomatically delicate. It marked one of Australia's most significant regional military engagements since Vietnam. The East Timor intervention revealed a new dimension of Australia's role, not as a distant colony dependent on imperial protection, but as a regional security leader. It also demonstrated the weight of moral responsibility in foreign policy decisions. Meanwhile, within Australia, questions of national identity resurfaced with renewed intensity. In 1999, Australians voted in a referendum on whether to become a republic, replacing the British monarch with an Australian head of state. The proposal was defeated, but the debate exposed divisions about tradition, independence, and constitutional design. The conversation did not end, it merely paused. The early 21st century brought another global shock. After the attacks of September 11, 2001, Australia invoked the ANZUS Treaty for the first time in its history. Australian forces joined operations in Afghanistan, later participating in the Iraq War. Once again, Australian troops served far from home in complex and controversial conflicts. The wars raised questions about alliance obligations, regional focus, and the long-term human cost of military engagement. Back home, security laws expanded. Counter-terrorism measures strengthened intelligence agencies. Border protection became a fiercely contested political issue, particularly regarding asylum seekers arriving by boat. Policies hardened. Offshore processing centers were established. The debate became one of the defining moral and political discussions of the era. Simultaneously, Australia faced growing environmental reckoning. Climate change intensified droughts and bushfires. Water management became critical, especially within the Murray-Darling Basin. Farmers confronted unpredictable seasons. Coastal communities monitored rising sea levels. The Great Barrier Reef experienced repeated coral bleaching events, raising global concern. In 2008, a symbolic moment of national significance occurred. Prime Minister Kevin Rudd delivered a formal apology to the stolen generations, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children removed from their families under past government policies. The apology was broadcast nationwide. Many Australians watched in silence. It did not erase trauma, but it marked an official acknowledgement of historical injustice. Yet reconciliation remained complex and unfinished. Conversations about constitutional recognition and Indigenous voice to Parliament continued into the 2020s. In 2023, Australians voted in a referendum proposing the establishment of an Indigenous voice to Parliament. The proposal was rejected by a majority of voters. The result revealed ongoing divisions about how best to address historical inequality and recognition. Economically, Australia rode waves of prosperity driven largely by resource exports to China. Mining towns expanded rapidly, infrastructure projects multiplied, but dependence on commodity markets also exposed vulnerability to global fluctuations and geopolitical tensions. As strategic rivalry intensified between the United States and China, Australia found itself navigating delicate diplomatic waters. Trade disputes emerged, tariffs were imposed, political rhetoric sharpened, yet economic interdependence remained profound. In 2021, Australia joined the AUKUS Security Pact with the United States and the United Kingdom, committing to acquire nuclear-powered submarines. The decision represented one of the most significant.
By the late 20th century, Australia no longer feared invasion fleets on the horizon. The anxiety of 1942 had faded into memory, but new tensions were emerging, less visible than warships, more complex than bombers overhead. The battlefield was no longer defined by coastlines, it was defined by influence, economics, information, and identity. The Cold War had ended, but uncertainty had not. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, Australia's strategic focus shifted decisively toward the Asia-Pacific region. Trade with Japan had already transformed the economy during the post-war boom. Now, rapidly rising economies like South Korea, Singapore, and later China were reshaping global markets. Iron ore from Western Australia, coal from Queensland, and agricultural exports flowed outward in volumes unimaginable just decades earlier. But economic opportunity carried strategic weight. Australia deepened its alliance with the United States, participating in joint military exercises and intelligence cooperation. Pine Gap, once shrouded almost entirely in secrecy, became publicly acknowledged as a satellite surveillance and signals intelligence facility. Though still highly classified in its operations, its presence symbolized Australia's integration into global security networks. At the same time, the Australian Defence Force underwent transformation. Rather than preparing solely for large-scale conventional invasion, planners emphasized regional stability operations. This shift would soon be tested. In 1999, violence erupted in East Timor after its population voted for independence from Indonesia. Militias backed by elements of the Indonesian military launched widespread destruction. Australia led the international force for East Timor, deploying thousands of troops to restore order. The mission was risky and diplomatically delicate. It marked one of Australia's most significant regional military engagements since Vietnam.
The East Timor intervention revealed a new dimension of Australia's role, not as a distant colony dependent on imperial protection, but as a regional security leader. It also demonstrated the weight of moral responsibility in foreign policy decisions. Meanwhile, within Australia, questions of national identity resurfaced with renewed intensity. In 1999, Australians voted in a referendum on whether to become a republic, replacing the British monarch with an Australian head of state. The proposal was defeated, but the debate exposed divisions about tradition, independence, and constitutional design. The conversation did not end, it merely paused. The early 21st century brought another global shock. After the attacks of September 11, 2001, Australia invoked the ANZUS Treaty for the first time in its history. Australian forces joined operations in Afghanistan, later participating in the Iraq War. Once again, Australian troops served far from home in complex and controversial conflicts. The wars raised questions about alliance obligations, regional focus, and the long-term human cost of military engagement. Back home, security laws expanded. Counter-terrorism measures strengthened intelligence agencies. Border protection became a fiercely contested political issue, particularly regarding asylum seekers arriving by boat. Policies hardened. Offshore processing centers were established. The debate became one of the defining moral and political discussions of the era. Simultaneously, Australia faced growing environmental reckoning. Climate change intensified droughts and bushfires. Water management became critical, especially within the Murray-Darling Basin. Farmers confronted unpredictable seasons. Coastal communities monitored rising sea levels. The Great Barrier Reef experienced repeated coral bleaching events, raising global concern. In 2008, a symbolic moment of national significance occurred. Prime Minister Kevin Rudd delivered
and Torres Strait Islander children removed from their families under past government policies. The apology was broadcast nationwide. Many Australians watched in silence. It did not erase trauma, but it marked an official acknowledgement of historical injustice. Yet reconciliation remained complex and unfinished. Conversations about constitutional recognition and Indigenous voice to Parliament continued into the 2020s. In 2023, Australians voted in a referendum proposing the establishment of an Indigenous voice to Parliament. The proposal was rejected by a majority of voters. The result revealed ongoing divisions about how best to address historical inequality and recognition. Economically, Australia rode waves of prosperity, driven largely by resource exports to China. Mining towns expanded rapidly, infrastructure projects multiplied, but dependence on commodity markets also exposed vulnerability to global fluctuations and geopolitical tensions. As strategic rivalry intensified between the United States and China, Australia found itself navigating delicate diplomatic waters. Trade disputes emerged, tariffs were imposed, political rhetoric sharpened, yet economic interdependence remained profound. In 2021, Australia joined the AUKUS Security Pact with the United States and the United Kingdom, committing to acquire nuclear-powered submarines. The decision represented one of the most significant defence investments in Australian history. Supporters argued it strengthened deterrence and regional security. Critics questioned cost, sovereignty, and long-term implications. Through all these developments, ordinary Australians continued to build lives shaped by both global forces and uniquely local realities. Cities like Sydney and Melbourne grew into multicultural hubs where dozens of languages echoed in a single street market. Remote communities maintained traditions stretching back tens of thousands of years. Farmers adapted to climate extremes with innovative techniques.
Scientists contributed to medical breakthroughs and space research. Entrepreneurs launched global technology companies from suburban garages. And then came the COVID-19 pandemic. Australia's geographic isolation, once considered a vulnerability, became an advantage. Strict border controls and lockdowns limited early spread. Daily life slowed, streets emptied, schools shifted online, communities rallied in new ways. But prolonged restrictions also brought economic strain and social tension. The pandemic revealed both the strength of public health systems and the fragility of global supply chains. Throughout it all, the deeper thread of Australia's hidden story persisted, a continent repeatedly tested, not always by invasion fleets, but by moral dilemmas, strategic crossroads, environmental extremes, and social transformation. The submarine nets in Sydney Harbour are long gone, the wartime blackout curtains have disappeared, but the underlying question remains unchanged from 1942. How does a nation at the edge of the Indo-Pacific balance security, independence, justice, and prosperity? Australia today stands neither isolated nor fully certain. It is woven into global systems of trade, intelligence, culture, and climate. It carries the legacy of ancient custodianship, colonial expansion, wartime fear, post-war reinvention, multicultural growth, and ongoing reconciliation. The hidden story was never only about submarines beneath the harbor or code breakers in shadowed rooms. It was about a country constantly redefining itself, sometimes under pressure, sometimes by choice. And as the 21st century unfolds, with rising sea levels, shifting alliances, technological revolutions, and generational change, Australia once again finds itself at a pivotal moment. The cliffs above Sydney Harbour still overlook. The 21st century did not arrive in Australia with cannon fire or coded radio transmissions. It arrived quietly, through fiber-optic cables beneath the ocean, satellites orbiting far above the desert interior, and aircraft landing daily from every corner of the world. The threats were no longer always visible, nor were the opportunities. Australia had entered a new era, one where geography still mattered, but technology and climate were redrawing the boundaries of power. By the 2010s, Australia was one of the most urbanized nations on Earth. Nearly 90% of its population lived in cities clustered along the coast. Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Perth, and Adelaide had become economic engines connected directly to Asian markets. Yet this coastal concentration created a new vulnerability. Rising sea levels and intensifying storms threatened infrastructure, housing, and ecosystems. The Great Barrier Reef, long considered one of the world's natural wonders, experienced repeated coral bleaching events due to warming oceans. Scientists warned that climate change was not a distant projection, it was already reshaping Australian landscapes. Inland, farmers faced harsher drought cycles. Water politics in the Murray-Darling Basin grew increasingly contentious. And then came the fires. The black summer of 2019-2020 burned with a ferocity that stunned the world. More than 18 million hectares were scorched. Entire towns were cut off by walls of flame. An estimated 3 billion animals were killed or displaced. Smoke drifted across the Pacific to South America. Firefighters, volunteers, and professionals alike worked relentlessly under apocalyptic skies. The crisis exposed the tension between economic dependence on fossil fuel exports and global climate responsibility. It forced national introspection. What kind of environmental future would Australia choose? At the same time, strategic competition in the Indo-Pacific intensified.
China had become Australia's largest trading partner, purchasing vast quantities of iron ore and natural gas. Yet diplomatic relations grew strained over issues including foreign interference, regional security, and calls for investigations into global health crises. Sanctions followed. Australian wine, barley, and coal faced restrictions. The episode revealed both the risks of economic concentration and the resilience of diversified markets. Australia sought to strengthen ties with India, Japan, Southeast Asia, and Europe, recalibrating its global engagement. The AUKUS agreement in 2021 marked another decisive turn. By committing to nuclear-powered submarines, Australia signaled a long-term strategic alignment with the United States and the United Kingdom. Supporters argued it ensured deterrence in an uncertain region. Critics questioned the cost, financially and diplomatically. The debate reflected an enduring national tension: independence versus alliance, sovereignty versus security guarantees. Yet while geopolitics dominated headlines, another transformation unfolded within. Australia's population had surpassed 26 million. Nearly half of all Australians were either born overseas or had at least one parent born overseas. Suburbs, once culturally uniform, became mosaics of language, religion, and cuisine. Lunar New Year festivals filled city streets. Diwali lights shone in town halls. Eid prayers echoed in community centers. Multiculturalism was no longer simply policy, it was lived reality. But unity was not automatic. Social media amplified divisions. Debates over immigration, identity, and national values resurfaced repeatedly. The 2023 referendum on establishing an Indigenous voice to Parliament, intended to give First Nations peoples formal advisory input on laws affecting them, failed to gain majority support. For some, it was a moment of disappointment. For others, it was a sign of caution about constitutional change. Either way, it demonstrated that reconciliation remains one of the most complex chapters of Australia's ongoing story. Yet the conversation did not end. Grassroots initiatives, local partnerships, land management collaborations, and cultural revitalization projects continued quietly across the country. Indigenous rangers worked to protect ecosystems using traditional knowledge combined with modern science. Language revival programs restored words nearly lost. Art, music, and literature amplified First Nations voices globally. Technology also reshaped the nation. Australian researchers contributed to medical breakthroughs, renewable energy innovation, and quantum computing. The CSIRO developed advancements in wireless networking decades earlier that had helped lay the groundwork for global Wi-Fi. Startups in Sydney and Melbourne attracted international investment. Space agencies launched satellites from remote South Australian deserts. In rural communities, drones monitored crops. Solar farms expanded across sun-drenched plains. Wind turbines dotted coastlines once known only for grazing cattle. Australia, one of the sunniest continents, began investing heavily in renewable potential, exploring hydrogen exports and battery storage technology. Yet the paradox remained. One of the world's largest coal exporters was also seeking leadership in clean energy transition. The COVID-19 pandemic left its own mark. For a time, Australia's borders were among the strictest in the world. International tourism vanished. Citizens stranded abroad struggled to return. Families were separated by state lines. But the early public health response limited fatalities compared to many countries. When borders reopened, migration resumed rapidly and economic activity rebounded. As the 2020s progressed, Australia found itself in a delicate balancing act. It was a Western liberal democracy embedded in an Asian region. It was an exporter of fossil fuels confronting climate urgency. It was a constitutional monarchy debating republicanism. It was a nation built on migration, still grappling with colonial legacy.
It was home to the oldest continuous cultures on Earth and one of the youngest federated states in modern history. And beneath these layers, one truth remained constant: resilience. From frontier conflict to world wars, from economic depression to global pandemics, from bushfires to geopolitical rivalry, Australia had repeatedly faced moments that demanded adaptation. Sometimes it responded boldly, sometimes imperfectly, but rarely passively. The hidden story that began with submarines in Sydney Harbour did not end with the war. It evolved into a broader narrative, one of quiet transformations beneath seemingly calm surfaces.
Today, if you stand again on the cliffs overlooking that harbor, you see ferries crossing blue water, tourists photographing the opera house, children learning to sail. It is peaceful. Yet beneath that calm lies centuries of layered history, ancient song lines crossing sandstone ridges, convict labor shaping early streets, secret wartime defenses, migrant hands building dams, activists demanding justice, scientists tracking reef temperatures, diplomats negotiating trade, firefighters defending towns, voters debating the nation's future. Australia's hidden story is not a single secret episode. It is the ongoing story of a continent constantly redefining itself at the intersection of isolation and connection. The question that began in 1942, what does it mean to defend and define a nation at the edge of the world, still echoes. But perhaps the answer has grown clearer over time. To defend Australia is not only to guard its shores, it is to protect its democracy, its environment, its multicultural fabric, and the ancient heritage that predates its modern borders. It is to acknowledge hard truths while imagining better futures. It is to recognize that beneath the Southern Cross, history is never finished. And as the sun rises over red deserts, tropical reefs, alpine peaks, and sprawling coastal cities, Australia continues writing its story, not hidden anymore, but unfolding openly for those willing to look beyond the horizon. If you travel far enough into the red heart of the continent, beyond the highways, beyond cattle stations, beyond even the last mobile signal, you reach a silence so vast it feels ancient. Under the night sky of Central Australia, the Milky Way burns brighter than almost anywhere else on Earth. For tens of thousands of years, First Nations peoples read those stars as stories, maps, and law. In the 21st century, scientists read them as data. And in that contrast, ancient knowledge and cutting-edge technology, you find the next hidden chapter of Australia. By the mid-2020s, the Indo-Pacific had become the most strategically contested region in the world. Australia was no longer a peripheral player. It was central, geographically and politically. Northern bases in Darwin were expanded. Rotational deployments of foreign troops increased. Military exercises grew in scale and complexity. But modern security was no longer defined only by ships and aircraft. Cybersecurity emerged as a new frontier. Government agencies reported rising levels of foreign interference and cyber espionage attempts targeting universities, infrastructure, and research institutions. Elections were monitored for digital manipulation. Critical infrastructure, from power grids to telecommunications, became part of national defense strategy. Australia established new cybersecurity frameworks, strengthening intelligence coordination. Quietly, analysts in Canberra and Adelaide worked to counter threats invisible to the public eye. The hidden war had shifted from submarines beneath harbors to code flowing through fiber optic cables. At the same time, the climate crisis intensified. The frequency of extreme weather events increased. Floods in Queensland and New South Wales displaced thousands. Insurance costs surged. Coastal erosion threatened iconic beaches. Agricultural regions confronted water scarcity with new urgency. Yet Australia also became a testing ground for renewable transformation. Massive solar farms in the Northern Territory and Queensland generated unprecedented output. Offshore wind proposals off the coast of Victoria gained traction. Green hydrogen projects were announced with ambitions to export clean energy to Asia. Communities that once depended solely on coal mining faced difficult transitions. Some resisted change, fearing job losses and economic decline. Others began retraining programs, investing in renewable manufacturing and battery storage. The debate was not abstract, it was personal, regional, and deeply tied to identity. Meanwhile, the conversation about reconciliation continued evolving. After the failed referendum on an Indigenous voice to Parliament, many communities shifted focus toward local and regional solutions. Land management partnerships expanded. Cultural heritage protections strengthened in some states. Universities increased Indigenous leadership representation. Yet frustration remained among those who believed national reform had stalled. Young Australians, Indigenous and non-Indigenous alike, became increasingly vocal. Marches filled city streets, social justice campaigns spread online. A new generation questioned not only policy decisions, but structural assumptions about growth, equity, and sustainability. Economically, Australia faced a delicate recalibration. China remained a dominant trade partner, particularly for iron ore, but diplomatic tension lingered. Defense spending increased significantly under AUKUS commitments. Budget debates centered on balancing security investment with healthcare, education, and social services. In outer space, another quiet transformation was underway. Australia re-established a national space agency in 2018. Launch facilities in South Australia and the Northern Territory began supporting satellite deployments. Remote deserts, once sites of secret Cold War tracking stations, were now platforms for commercial and scientific launches. The same skies that Indigenous astronomers had mapped for millennia were hosting new ambitions. Technology reshaped everyday life as well. Artificial intelligence integrated into mining operations, medical diagnostics, and environmental modeling. Remote work changed urban planning patterns. Regional towns experienced population growth as city dwellers sought affordability and lifestyle balance. Yet beneath progress lay fragility. Housing affordability reached crisis levels in Sydney and Melbourne. Rental shortages strained families. Infrastructure lagged behind rapid population growth. Political debate grew increasingly polarized, influenced by global trends in populism and misinformation. And still, Australians demonstrated a recurring national trait: community resilience. When floods swept through Lismore, volunteers arrived with boats. When bushfires threatened towns, neighbors formed human chains. During the pandemic, local businesses adapted overnight. The instinct to rally, sometimes described simply as mateship, persisted across generations. By the late 2020s, Australia stood at another crossroads. It was more connected to Asia than ever before. Its defense strategy leaned heavily on technological superiority and alliances. Its economy sought to pivot towards renewable exports while managing resource dependency. Its society grew more diverse, younger, and digitally fluent. Its historical reckoning remained ongoing. In Parliament, debates grew sharper about constitutional reform, environmental targets, and economic diversification. Universities expanded research partnerships across the Indo-Pacific. Defense white papers emphasized deterrence through capability rather than geography. And in the red deserts at night, astronomers and traditional custodians sometimes stood beneath the same sky, one reading data from distant galaxies, the other tracing ancestral narratives in the stars. Australia's hidden story had entered a new phase, not of secrecy, but of complexity. No longer was the primary question whether naval vessels might appear on the horizon. Now the questions were broader. How does Australia maintain sovereignty in a digitally interconnected world? How does it balance alliance loyalty with regional diplomacy? How does it transition energy systems without fracturing communities? How does it honor 60,000 years of continuous culture while innovating for the next century? The harbor in Sydney remains calm most mornings. Ferries glide past the Opera House. Tourists gather at Curlier Quay. Few notice the naval vessels docked quietly at Garden Island. Fewer still consider the intelligence streams flowing through secure networks and the satellites orbiting overhead. But history has taught Australians something essential. Security is not only physical. Identity is not fixed, and resilience is not accidental. It is built, tested, and rebuilt across generations. From ancient custodianship to convict survival, from wartime secrecy to digital vigilance, from migrant-built dams to solar-powered deserts, Australia's journey has never been linear. It has been adaptive. And as the Southern Cross rises each night above cities and outback alike, the nation continues writing its...
The final chapter of Australia's hidden story is not written in secrecy, nor in war rooms, nor in classified cables running beneath oceans. It is being written in classrooms, on fire-scarred farmland, inside research laboratories, in parliament chambers, in suburban homes where multiple languages are spoken at the dinner table, and on country where ancient law still guides the rhythm of life. By the early 2030s, Australia had fully entered an era defined less by singular events and more by sustained choices. The AUKUS submarine program moved from announcement to infrastructure. Shipyards in South Australia expanded dramatically. Apprenticeships surged. Engineers trained overseas returned with specialized skills. Billions flowed into defense industry, reshaping local economies. For some Australians, it represented strategic maturity. For others, it symbolized risk, binding the nation tightly to great power competition in an increasingly unstable Indo-Pacific. But even as submarines were designed, another transformation gathered speed. Renewable energy production overtook coal-fired generation for the first time. Vast solar arrays in Queensland and the Northern Territory exported electricity through undersea cables and hydrogen conversion plants. Former mining communities diversified into rare earth processing and battery manufacturing. Australia, long known as a quarry of the world, began redefining itself as a clean energy powerhouse. The transition was not smooth. There were political battles, there were job losses and retraining programs, there were regional fears about being left behind. But over time, economic necessity and environmental urgency aligned. The climate itself continued to demand attention. Some coastal towns implemented managed retreat strategies as rising seas threatened infrastructure. Agricultural innovation became essential. Drought-resistant crops, water recycling, indigenous fire management practices integrated into national bushfire strategy. Indigenous knowledge, once marginalized, became increasingly valued in environmental policy. Ranger programs expanded across northern Australia. Cultural burning techniques reduced fuel loads and protected biodiversity. Universities partnered with elders in collaborative research models that respected intellectual sovereignty. Meanwhile, Australia's population approached 30 million. Urban density increased. Public transport networks expanded. High-speed rail projects, long debated, finally connected major East Coast cities. Regional hubs flourished as digital connectivity reduced the necessity of centralized corporate offices. Geopolitically, Australia balanced carefully. Relations with China stabilized into pragmatic coexistence, competitive, cautious, yet economically intertwined. Partnerships with India deepened. Pacific Island nations became central diplomatic priorities, particularly regarding climate adaptation and infrastructure development. Australia's identity shifted further toward being not just a Western outpost in Asia, but an Indo-Pacific nation embedded in its region. At home, conversations about national identity matured. Younger generations viewed multiculturalism not as policy, but as reality. Australian identity was no longer tied primarily to Anglo heritage. It was layered: Greek Australian, Vietnamese Australian, Sudanese Australian, Indigenous Australian, Anglo-Celtic Australian, all sharing space under one constitutional system. The monarchy debate resurfaced periodically, but lost its urgency amid more immediate economic and environmental concerns. Instead, constitutional conversations increasingly focused on practical reconciliation frameworks and structural reform at local levels. The Aboriginal Tent Embassy still stood in Canberra, a reminder that unfinished history does not disappear. But alongside it stood new Indigenous-led enterprises, media organizations, university programs, and political leaders shaping policy directly. The hidden war of 1942 once forced Australia to confront vulnerability. The climate crises of the 2020s forced it to confront sustainability. The geopolitical tensions of the 2030s forced it to confront strategic independence. Each era demanded adaptation. Yet, if there is a single thread that runs through Australia's astonishing, layered story, from ancient songlines to satellite networks, it is this: Australia survives not because it avoids crisis, but because it evolves through it. The harbour at Sydney remains symbolic. In 1788, it marked colonial beginning. In 1942, it marked wartime fear. In the 2000s, it symbolized global celebration during the Olympics. In the decades ahead, it will likely symbolize something else entirely. Perhaps technological innovation, perhaps climate resilience, perhaps reconciliation made real. But the true heart of the nation lies beyond any single landmark. It lies in the deserts where stars burn over red earth, in the rainforests of Queensland where ancient ecosystems adapt, in suburban schools where children of dozens of backgrounds recite the same national anthem, in rural communities rebuilding after fire and flood, in policy debates that wrestle openly with difficult truths rather than burying them. The hidden story was never just about submarines, code breakers, or secret alliances. It was about awakening. A young colony once believed distance guaranteed safety. A mid-century nation discovered vulnerability forged strength. A modern state realized that security now includes climate, cyber, culture, and cohesion. The Southern Cross still rises each night over this vast continent. It shone above indigenous astronomers 60,000 years ago. It shone above convict ships. It shone above wartime blackouts. It shone above migrant camps and Olympic fireworks. It shines now over wind farms, research labs, naval shipyards, and sacred sites. And beneath that constellation, Australia continues. Not perfect, not without division, not without unresolved history, but resilient, adaptive, unfinished. The hidden story ends not with closure, but with continuity. Because Australia is not a chapter that can be sealed. It is a continent still learning how to balance ancient custodianship with modern ambition, alliance with independence, prosperity with responsibility. And as long as the tides move in Sydney Harbour, as long as red dust rises in the interior, and as long as voices, old and new, continue debating what this nation should become, the story goes on. Under the Southern Cross, unhidden.